Today's video is sponsored by Skillshare. In November last year, Fujifilm announced a software update that brings pixel shift to the GFX100, meaning it can now capture 400 megapixel photos, which is amazing news, only I don't own a GFX100. It's 10 grand for the body only. But lucky for me, I was able to rent one from Lens Library, so I get to experience what it's like to be that probably 2% of photographers who actually got to enjoy the new firmware. But let's first address the fact that the GFX100 is already a resolution beast to begin with. It natively shoots at just under 102 megapixels, which by today's standards is already considered a monstrosity, already overkill even for most professional assignments, and now they're just turning it up to over 400 megapixels. The final resulting images have a resolution of 23,296 by 17,472. That actually translates to about 407 megapixels. Bonkers. So let's get right down to it. Before we begin, there are two critical concerns to take into account when shooting pixel shift on the GFX100. Number one, your subject cannot move, and number two, your camera cannot move. Well, that's kind of inconvenient, and yes, it has to do with how pixel shift works. It's actually taking 16 photos and then combining them into one high-resolution photo, and every time one of those 16 photos are taken, the camera's actually moving the sensor ever so slightly in a sequence of directions using the same system that drives the in-body image stabilization. When you later combine those 16 different exposures, it's actually putting together all the little bits of extra information between pixels that were able to be captured by shifting the sensor at a sub-pixel level. And I'm sure most of us are curious to see what that shifting sensor looks like, so I took a pixel shift sequence with the sensor exposed, and nothing. According to this help article published by Fujifilm, it shifts the sensor by half a pixel per exposure. This GFX100 has a pixel pitch of 3.76 microns. Half a pixel would then mean that the sensor was moving by just 1.88 microns at a time. For reference, a human hair on average is about 75 microns thick, so the sensor was indeed moving, but if your eyes were somehow able to see it, you're probably Superman. So now that we've established that even micro-level movements can be enough to mess up our pixel shift image, that does unfortunately throw a huge range of photography applications out the window, including most types of landscape photography. So finding a subject to showcase this feature with was actually way harder than I imagined. In the end, I just decided to do some still life of a couple of items around the studio. You first activate pixel shift by selecting multi-shot on the mode dial and then selecting pixel shift in the drive menu. For the highest success rate, I used the sturdiest tripod I could possibly get my hands on, and I made sure to touch absolutely nothing in the setup right before the exposure. I even used the mobile app to trigger the camera so I don't even have to touch it. And so begins the 16 shots. In pixel shift mode, it's also electronic shutter only, so there is zero chance of shutter shock. Afterwards, you do have to combine the exposures using a computer. You can't do it in camera. The software called Pixel Shift Combiner is available for free on Fuji's website. And while the Pixel Shift Combiner is hard at work combining our images, let me introduce a class that I recently watched and really enjoyed on Skillshare called Find Your Style: 5 Exercises to Unlock Your Creative Identity. It's taught by Andy J. Pizza, and I think it's something that would resonate with a lot of us. I found it particularly enlightening when Andy defines style in his second lesson as the sum of all the creative choices you make consistently. And just in case you haven't heard of Skillshare yet, it's an online community for creative and curious people like us built specifically around learning and exploring. It's home to thousands of inspiring classes that help us explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and just to get lost in creativity. Some other really cool topics that I discovered on Skillshare are like this one taught by Amity Zatska on shooting and editing conceptual photos entirely on your iPhone. There's also one made by professional colorist Fred Trevino offering 10 quick tips on color grading, and this one on establishing your social media presence through personal branding by Kate Ahrens. It costs less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, and being curated specifically for learning means there's no ads on the platform so we can stay focused. They're constantly launching new premium classes, and the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Now we're done combining our 16 raw photos into a huge DNG file, let's go ahead and check them out in Photoshop. Now this, ladies and gents, is what a 400 megapixel DNG file looks like. Well, now it certainly doesn't look too impressive, not until we zoom in on it at least, which we will do in just a moment, but I have also here pulled up the normal 100 megapixel version taken from one of the 16 pixel shift exposures, just to calibrate our expectations on how ridiculous 400 megapixels actually is. So this is 100 megapixels, and let me zoom it in to 100%. So this is a 100% crop of a 102 megapixel file on an iMac with a 5K display. Now let's go over to the 400 megapixel version of this photo and do the same amount of crop. So 100% crop, and you can see there is so much more magnification when compared to the 100 megapixel variant. And just look how ridiculous this is. Check out how far I can zoom in before the individual pixel lines begin showing up in Adobe Photoshop. So this is at 1200% zoom, and the pixel lines have just begun appearing. Now, if you look over at my navigator, look how ridiculously small of an area of the image we're looking at. This is how far you have to go before the individual pixels even begin showing up. Here's another 400 megapixel shot, and this time around I'm going to zoom it into 100% on a 4K timeline. And this is pixel to pixel 4K, meaning if you are watching this on a 4K UHD display, even at this level of magnification, you're still looking at 3,840 columns of pixels running from the left side of your screen to the right. And while we're here, let's take a moment to appreciate just how detailed these 400 megapixel photos are. This here is a HomePod, and look how it's able to reveal the individual weaves on the outer fabric of this HomePod. You can even see all the detail in the inner layer of fabric. And how about this shot we were just at earlier? This is the back of a 3.5-inch hard drive, and if we zoom into this printed circuit board on the back here, it's got a ton of fine detail and lots of really small markings. Under 400 megapixels, every single one of these markings is clearly visible. We could even fill our entire screen with this single tiny screw if we wanted to. And if we move up here to have a closer look at the SATA pins, you can just see how much detail is being revealed here. Each of the pins actually has a slightly different height. You can see the texture on the metal of the pins, and you can even see the wear marks on the contact points of the pins. If we move over here a little bit, you can see there's a bit of fuzz or dust that got caught up here. Again, this is something that would be completely invisible if we zoom it back out to its original scale. And here's a shot of a Fuji X-T3. Now, when we're shooting such high resolution on medium format, the depth of field that you have to work with is incredibly shallow. So if we zoom in on the Fujifilm logo, you can see it's slightly soft, even though I did expose this photo at f7.1. The focus was actually set to the body plate over here, and the logo badge actually protrudes a little bit, and that was enough to throw it ever so slightly out of focus. But if we take a closer look at this dial over here, you can see there's bits of dust just chilling between the dial and the body. And those little pyramids that are on there to texture the dial look absolutely massive under 400 megapixels. And you can even see the texture of the metal that's on those little pyramids themselves. If you had a macro lens, surely you would be able to reveal all this detail, but bear in mind we're looking at a photo that's framed up like this. Now let's zoom in on that X-T3 model badge over there, and we can see, because it's recessed a little bit into the body, it's actually collected quite a bit of gunk inside it. It's not the prettiest sight, but I can see it's definitely catching some stuff in there that would otherwise be completely impossible to notice. But here's something that I thought was really cool, because this draws the line between 100 and 400 megapixels. If we zoom in to this little curve underneath the M, now this is a 100 megapixel photo. This is not the 400 megapixel photo, this is 100 megapixels. And if we have a close look down here, you can see there's actually a bit of dust collecting in this curve over here. It's detailed enough for us to know that that might be dust, but we can't see the details of the dust. Now let's see what happens when we quadruple the number of pixels. So here is the 400 megapixel version of that image, and let's zoom in to that same area. And here you can see quite clearly the individual specks of dust. When you're dealing with detail this fine, 400 megapixels actually reveals quite a bit more. And you can really see that in the side-by-side between 100 and 400 megapixels. And now I'm going to switch to the selection tool and show you guys what a 1080p selection looks like. So this selection here measures exactly 1920 by 1080 pixels. So in a 407 megapixel frame, all it takes is this tiny rectangle to contain the same amount of pixels as a single frame of 1080p video. In case you're wondering what a failed pixel shift shot looks like, say if you went ahead and shot something that moves, this is what you get, some really odd-looking digital artifacts. On some other cameras that also have pixel shift, like Sony's newer A7Rs and Panasonic's S1s, those are able to handle some amount of movement within the frame because those actually apply intelligent image processing algorithms to the combined image. On the GFX, the pixel shift is, relatively speaking, a more rudimentary version. It's just a mathematical algorithm that merges the exposures as is. That's also because the primary use case that Fujifilm released this feature for is artwork preservation. It's one way to digitize valuable paintings while capturing as much detail as possible, and in that sense, it is essential that there is no amount of alteration being applied from image processing that could potentially compromise the originality of the photographed work. And one last thing that I would like to highlight in this video is the storage cost of shooting 400 megapixel pixel shift on the GFX. You first begin by shooting 16 raw exposures, that's in the ballpark of about 100 megabytes per photo. The single merged 400 megapixel DNG file is around 1.4 gigabytes, and if you export a high quality JPEG out of that DNG, that's going to be another 150 megabytes or so. Assuming you keep all the originals, that would be over 3 gigabytes per 400 megapixel shot. I'll leave download links below for the full resolution 400 megapixel JPEGs, and for those who have been supporting this channel on Patreon, I will be giving access to the huge 400 megapixel DNG files to all my patrons. This has really been just one big video on pixel peeping. If you made it this far, then congratulations, I suppose we can now consider ourselves master pixel peepers. If you can't get enough of 400 megapixel pixel peeping, check out my buddy Jayz's video on this same topic. He even painted his own artwork to digitize. Go check it out.